I never told my wife I was the anonymous investor behind her father's empire. The crystal glasses clinked like tiny bells around the mahogany table. Corvin Hale raised his wine, his voice booming across the dining room. "To our anonymous investors," he said, smiling at everyone except me. "Without their vision and capital, Hale Industries wouldn't be the empire it is today." He took a long drink, then looked directly at me. "Of course, not everyone understands how real business works." The other family members nodded and laughed softly. I sat there in my simple button-down shirt, watching the man toast the very money I'd been quietly putting into his company for 8 years. My name is Eamon Vale, and I married into a family that mistakes silence for weakness. They had no idea that every dollar Corvin was celebrating came from me. Lyra's fingers brushed mine under the table. "Hold your glass by the stem, honey," she whispered, adjusting my wine glass like I was a child learning table manners. Her smile was gentle, but I caught the embarrassment in her eyes. Around us, her family discussed business deals worth millions. Corvin mentioned a new factory expansion. Meredith, my mother-in-law, talked about the social events they'd attend to celebrate their success. I was sitting right there, but the conversation flowed around me like I was furniture. Nobody asked my opinion. Nobody looked at me when important things were discussed. I was Eamon, the guy who somehow convinced their precious daughter to marry down. What they didn't know was that I owned 62% of everything they were bragging about. Benton Cross, the family's CFO, spread financial reports across the coffee table. "The quarterly numbers are exceptional," he said, pointing at charts and graphs. Corvin leaned forward, studying the papers with the intensity of someone who actually understood them. Meredith asked intelligent questions about market positioning. Even Lyra chimed in with thoughts about the luxury division. I sat in my chair, invisible. When I reached toward the reports to take a look, Benton smoothly slid them away. "These are pretty technical," he said with a polite smile. "Lots of industry-specific terminology." I nodded and sat back, knowing those numbers better than anyone in the room. After all, I was the one who'd provided most of the capital that created them. But in their eyes, I was just Lyra's husband, who worked some ordinary job they never bothered to understand. Eamon married into opportunity, Corvin announced to his golf buddies during Sunday dinner. The men chuckled knowingly while their wives smiled with practiced politeness. "Lucky man, getting access to this level of business and social standing." He clapped me on the shoulder like he was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. I cut my steak and stayed quiet. Around the table, conversations continued about private clubs, vacation homes, and investment strategies that I could have taught them about. But I was the outsider, the one who needed to be grateful for being included. Lyra squeezed my hand supportively, but she didn't disagree with her father's assessment. In her mind, I was the fortunate one too. None of them questioned where the Hale family money actually came from. They just assumed it had always been there, growing naturally under Corvin's brilliant leadership. That night, I stood in our bedroom watching Lyra brush her hair. She was beautiful, elegant, everything I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. "You know my father doesn't mean anything by those comments," she said softly. "He's just proud of what he's built." I nodded, because what was I supposed to say? That her father's empire would crumble without my anonymous investments? That every major business decision he made only worked because I was quietly managing the financial foundation? Instead, I kissed her goodnight and went to my office. I opened my laptop and checked the accounts that nobody knew belonged to me. Eamon Vale might be invisible at family dinners, but EV Holdings owned controlling interest in Hale Industries. I'd been keeping their empire alive for 8 years, and they treated me like I should be grateful for the privilege of watching them succeed. The conversations changed gradually. Lyra started having money discussions with her parents when I wasn't around. "It's easier this way," she explained after I walked into a room and everyone suddenly stopped talking. "You know how you get when we discuss investments and business strategy." I didn't get any way. I just listened. But apparently, my presence made them uncomfortable. So they began excluding me entirely. Sunday dinners became strategic planning sessions that I watched from the sidelines. Phone calls between Lyra and her father happened behind closed doors. When I asked about family business decisions, Lyra would give me vague answers and change the subject. They were protecting me, she said, from complicated financial discussions that might stress me out. The irony was almost funny. They were sheltering me from conversations about money that was actually mine. Corvin announced his most ambitious project yet during a family meeting I wasn't invited to attend. Lyra told me about it later, her eyes bright with excitement. Dad wants to acquire 3 smaller companies and merge them into one massive operation, she explained. It's risky, but the potential profits are incredible. I asked about the financing structure and timeline. Where would the capital come from? What were the debt ratios? How would they handle integration costs? Lyra looked at me with that patient smile she'd been using more often lately. Honey, Dad and Benton have all that figured out. You don't need to worry about the technical details. But I did need to worry. Because the technical details determined whether this aggressive expansion would destroy everything I'd spent 8 years building. And nobody was asking my opinion about risking my own money. I tried to offer caution during the next family gathering. Expansion can be dangerous, I said quietly when Corvin described his acquisition timeline. Maybe it's worth moving slower, making sure each step is solid before taking the next one. The room went silent. Corvin stared at me like I'd suggested burning money for warmth. Eamon, he said slowly, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the scale we're operating at. This isn't about playing it safe. This is about seizing opportunities while they exist. Meredith nodded approvingly. Benton mumbled something about market timing. Even Lyra looked embarrassed by my conservative suggestion. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks, she said gently, trying to soften her father's dismissal. I was the only person in the room who actually understood their financial position, and they treated my advice like amateur nervousness. After the meeting, Lyra apologized privately. I know Dad can be harsh, she said, taking my hands in hers, but he's built something incredible, and he knows what he's doing. She explained that her father had started with nothing and created an empire through bold decisions and aggressive moves. Playing it safe was what kept people ordinary, she said. I wanted to tell her that her father hadn't built anything alone, that his bold decisions only worked because someone else was quietly managing the financial foundation. But how could I explain 8 years of secret investments without sounding like I'd been lying to her? Instead, I held her close and promised I understood. She kissed me and said she loved me for caring about her family's success. What she didn't say was that she respected my business judgment. Love was still there between us. Respect had quietly disappeared. I realized the full scope of the problem during a dinner where Lyra publicly supported every decision her father made, then privately told me she hoped I wouldn't take his dismissiveness personally. She was caught between her loyalty to her family and her love for me, and family was winning. When Corvin described me as someone who doesn't understand how wealth is created, she nodded along. When Meredith suggested I might be more comfortable sitting out business discussions, Lyra agreed it was probably for the best. Later that night, she apologized and said she was trying to keep peace between everyone she cared about. But I could see which side she chose whenever there was conflict. Her father's approval mattered more than my feelings. Their family legacy was more important than our marriage partnership. I was becoming a guest in my own wife's life. The major deals started falling apart on a Tuesday morning. Corvin had committed to acquiring 2 companies simultaneously, believing his credit lines and investor confidence could handle the financial pressure. But markets shifted overnight, and suddenly, the deal looked dangerous instead of brilliant. During an emergency family meeting, Corvin's voice was tight with stress. Someone in this room has been spreading doubt, he announced, scanning faces around the table. Weak voices create weak results. His eyes stopped on me. I hadn't said anything to anyone outside the family, but I was the only person who'd expressed caution. In Corvin's mind, my conservative advice had somehow jinxed his aggressive strategy. The family watched as he blamed me for creating negative energy around a deal that was failing because of his own miscalculations. Nobody defended me, not even Lyra. The argument escalated that evening. Lyra stood in our kitchen, her face flushed with frustration. "You need to leave," she said quietly. "Just for a while, until you figure out what direction you want your life to take." I asked what she meant by direction. She explained that I seemed lost, unmotivated, unsure of my place in the world. Her family was building something important, and I was contributing negative energy that undermined their confidence. "Maybe some time apart will help you find your purpose," she said, not meeting my eyes. I understood what she was really saying. Her family's success was more important than our marriage. Their approval was more valuable than our partnership. If I couldn't support their vision without reservation, I wasn't welcome in their world anymore. It was them or me, and she was choosing them. Corvin made it official the next morning. He called me into his office and spoke like a CEO delivering bad news to an underperforming employee. "You're dead weight," he said simply. "I've watched you drain energy from every room, every conversation, every opportunity we've tried to pursue. Lyra deserves better than someone who holds her back." He handed me a folder with legal papers that revoked my access to family accounts, properties, and business meetings. Effective immediately, I was no longer welcome at Hale Industries functions or family financial discussions. "Take some time to think about whether you want to be the kind of man who elevates the people around him," Corvin said, "or the kind who brings them down to his level." I signed the papers without argument. After all, I was about to show him exactly what kind of man I really was. I packed quietly that afternoon while Lyra was at her parents' house. 2 suitcases, my laptop, and the watch my grandfather had given me. I left my tea on the kitchen counter along with a simple note: "I hope you find what you're looking for." I didn't take any of the expensive gifts they'd given me over the years, didn't argue about property or possessions. Walking away felt clean, honest, like shedding a costume I'd worn too long. I drove to a modest hotel downtown and checked in under my own name. For the first time in 3 years, I was just Eamon Vale again. Not Lyra's husband or Corvin's disappointing son-in-law. That night, I sat in my small hotel room and smiled. They thought they'd gotten rid of their biggest problem. They had no idea their biggest problem was just getting started. I opened my laptop and logged into the account that would change everything. EV Holdings appeared on the screen with numbers that represented 8 years of careful, strategic investments. 62% ownership of Hale Industries. Controlling interest in every subsidiary. Majority voting rights on all major business decisions. I'd been invisible at family dinners, dismissed in boardrooms, treated like someone who didn't understand business. But I was the business. Every expansion they celebrated, every profit they bragged about, every success they claimed as their own had been built on my capital. Tomorrow, they would learn the difference between being powerful and being dependent. Tonight, I was going to sleep better than I had in months. Because when you own controlling interest in someone's empire, you don't need their approval to destroy it. The first action was subtle but devastating. As the anonymous majority shareholder of Hale Industries, I filed an injunction to freeze the risky merger Corvin was pursuing. The legal paperwork appeared on Benton's desk Wednesday morning, signed by lawyers representing EV Holdings. I watched from my hotel room as news reports mentioned shareholder concerns about the acquisition. Corvin would be furious, scrambling to understand why his anonymous investors were suddenly questioning his judgment. He'd built his entire expansion strategy around this merger, and now it was legally frozen until further review. The beautiful irony was that he'd probably blame my negative energy for jinxing the deal. He'd never imagined that the person he'd called dead weight actually had the power to stop him with a simple legal filing. This was just the beginning. Benton Cross received the call Thursday afternoon. I could imagine his face going pale as the bank explained that EV Holdings was requesting immediate review of all outstanding credit arrangements. As majority shareholder, I had the right to examine every loan, every credit line, every financial commitment Corvin had made using company assets as collateral. The bank was simply following protocol. But for Benton, it meant that someone with enormous influence was asking uncomfortable questions. He'd have to scramble to prepare documentation, justify every financial decision, explain why the company deserved continued credit support. I'd been dismissed as someone who didn't understand finance. Now I was putting their entire financial structure under a microscope, and they didn't even know it was me. The credit lines vanished overnight. Not because of any wrongdoing, but because banks get nervous when majority shareholders start asking questions. Risk assessment protocols kicked in automatically. Loan officers wanted additional documentation. Credit approvals that had been routine suddenly required committee review. By Friday morning, Hale Industries was facing a liquidity crisis that seemed to come from nowhere. Corvin had structured his business model around easy access to capital, and now that access was evaporating. The irony was perfect. The man who'd called me financially naive was discovering that his empire couldn't survive basic financial scrutiny. He'd been building with my money while insulting my intelligence, and now he was learning the difference between borrowed power and real ownership. Corvin spent Friday in crisis meetings, trying to understand why his financial world was collapsing. Phone calls with bankers who suddenly seemed uncertain about his company's stability. Emergency sessions with accountants reviewing every transaction. Angry conversations with lawyers demanding explanations for shareholder actions that seemed designed to sabotage his business. He'd wake up Monday morning to discover that someone with enormous power was systematically dismantling his empire, but he'd never suspect the quiet man he'd dismissed as dead weight. In his mind, this was just bad timing. Market uncertainty, perhaps even sabotage by business competitors. The possibility that his former son-in-law owned controlling interest in everything he'd built would never occur to him. Some revelations are too devastating to imagine. Lyra called me Saturday evening, her voice shaking with confusion and fear. "Eamon, something terrible is happening to Dad's business," she said. "The money is just disappearing. Credit lines are being frozen, deals are falling apart, and nobody understands why." She sounded lost, desperate for someone to make sense of the chaos. I listened with genuine sympathy. After all, I loved Lyra deeply, even if our marriage couldn't survive her family's arrogance. "Maybe it's just a rough patch," I said gently. "These things happen in business." She asked if I thought there was anything she could do to help. I suggested she focus on supporting her family emotionally rather than trying to solve financial problems she didn't fully understand. It was good advice, and I meant it sincerely. What I didn't mention was that the person who could fix everything was the same person they decided was dead weight. Monday morning's emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I didn't attend in person, but my legal representatives were there with documentation that would change everything. The agenda was simple: review the ownership structure of Hale Industries and discuss recent shareholder actions. When the lawyers revealed that EV Holdings owned 62% of the company, the room erupted in confusion. Benton Cross demanded to know who was behind the investment entity. Phone calls were made to banks, law firms, accounting agencies. Within an hour, they had their answer. Eamon Vale, the man they dismissed as financially ignorant, was the anonymous investor who'd been keeping their empire alive for 8 years. The revelation was so shocking that Corvin reportedly sat in silence for 20 minutes, staring at paperwork that proved his worst nightmare was true. The phone calls started immediately after the meeting ended. Corvin first, his voice a mixture of rage and desperation. "You can't do this," he shouted into my voicemail. "I built this company from nothing. You can't just take it away because your feelings were hurt." Then Marith, more controlled but equally panicked. She left a message explaining that there had been misunderstandings, but family was family, and surely we could work together to resolve this situation. Benton called to discuss transition strategies and damage control. The only call I answered was from Lyra. She was crying, confused, angry, and heartbroken all at once. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why did you let us treat you like that when you could have stopped at any time?" I explained that I'd wanted to see who they really were when they thought they had all the power. Now I knew. Lyra came to my hotel that evening. She looked exhausted, her perfect composure finally cracked. "I understand why you're angry," she began. "We treated you terribly, but you're my husband. We can fix this. You can take control of the company, make Dad work for you. Prove that you were the powerful one all along. She was offering me everything I'd supposedly wanted: recognition, respect, control over the family empire. But sitting in my modest hotel room, looking at the woman I'd loved enough to marry, I realized I didn't want any of it anymore. Power that comes from proving people wrong isn't real power. Control that depends on other people's acknowledgement isn't real control. I'd spent 8 years building their empire while they built my resentment. Walking away was the only victory that mattered. I declined reconciliation the next morning, not out of spite or anger, but because some things can't be repaired once they're broken. I loved you enough to let your family reveal who they really were, I told Lyra during our final conversation. And you loved them enough to choose their approval over our partnership. She cried and apologized and promised things would be different, but we both knew the damage was permanent. She'd supported every dismissal, every insult, every moment when her family treated me like I was beneath them. When forced to choose, she'd chosen them repeatedly. I couldn't build a life with someone who respected me only when I proved I was more powerful than the people she'd always respected more. Love isn't enough when respect dies. Some bridges burn completely. I walked away from all of it. The company, the family, the marriage, the money. My lawyers structured the sale of my controlling interest to a private investment group that would treat Corvin as exactly what he was: a middle manager who'd been pretending to be an empire builder. He could stay if he wanted, but he'd never again mistake borrowed power for real ownership. I kept enough money to live quietly and anonymously, the way I preferred. Sometimes I see their names in business publications, usually in articles about restructuring and new management strategies. Lyra sent a letter 6 months later, saying she finally understood what she'd lost. But understanding doesn't undo years of choosing status over partnership. I'm at peace now, wealthy enough to be comfortable, invisible enough to be free. The most dangerous person at any table is still the one everyone's ignoring. I just learned to prefer sitting at my own table instead. The end.